Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening for our second public keynote speaker as part of the ICS Summer School in 3D Imaging and Modeling in Cultural Heritage and Classics. So before we begin the presentation, just a couple of notes. We are recording this session, so if you are wanting to ask a question afterwards, just be aware, and if you don't want to be recorded, maybe keep your camera off. Please stay muted this whole time, and if you have questions, you can write them in the chat or raise your hand at the end when we open up for discussion. So this evening we have Chiara Piccoli joining us, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam, and she works on virtual interiors from the Dutch Golden Age. And she was also my former instructor on 3D modeling at Leiden University, so it's always a pleasure for me to continue learning from her. So she's going to be presenting visualizing and experiencing past cities in 3D, methods, opportunities, and challenges. So whenever you're ready.
Thank you. So I'll share my screen with you. Yeah, so hopefully now you can see the presentation. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. One of my research interests is the use of 3D reconstructions as research tools to aid the interpretation of archaeological and historical records. And in this presentation, I'll talk about some of the applications of 3D modeling techniques to visualize various kinds of contexts at different scales. So I chose the city as a whole, individual houses, and the objects within. And to do so, I'll take some examples, some of the projects that I worked on in the last few years as examples. And this will give me the opportunity to discuss the methods that are most appropriate for each case and what kind of research questions we can investigate by using these tools and the challenges that we encounter in the process. So to start this presentation, I'd like first to go back in time, because reconstructions became popular with the introduction of digital media, of course, but actually they were preceded by a long tradition of visual representations that can be traced back to the early modern period. And I think it's important to take this long-term perspective into account so that we have more food for thought to reflect upon the ways in which the transition to the digital medium can help us in creating new opportunities for analysis and communication. And for this reason, in the next few slides, I'll briefly go through a few examples of visual reconstructions made before the introduction of digital media. All of them, as you can see in this sort of preview, relate to the city of Rome, since its buildings in ruins have fascinated generations of antiquarian scholars and travelers, and of course they still do. And this has left us abundant material to select some examples from. In these evocative early modern visual reconstructions, the extant remains were often mixed with contemporary elements, for example, architectural styles or clothing, as you can see in this 15th century reconstruction of the Forum. And of course, filled in by a high degree of imagination. But we shouldn't discard these drawings because of their low historical accuracy, since they are useful documentations, first of all, of the interest for these buildings and their stories in the early modern period, as well as representations of the state of the knowledge on antiquity at that time. And this aspect is also relevant for digital 3D reconstructions, which we shouldn't forget are in fact knowledge representations that can always be superseded when new data is available. Already in their early use, reconstruction drawings were used for educational purposes, and the importance of these visual representations to illustrate the ruins in their complete state was already well understood. I'd like to introduce to you Hans Gross, a 17th century Swiss guard and a tourist guide that you can see here with a group of German tourists in front of the Meta Sudans, a large conical fountain in front of the Colosseum built in the Flavian period. Gross sponsored the printing of this edition of Giacomo Laurus' Antiquae Urbi Splendor, which contained this and many other reconstruction drawings, because he said they help him explain and visualize the lost appearance of Roman landmarks to the tourists he guided through the city. Besides their expressive power, these images were also used as interpretative tools by architects to better understand and get inspiration from ancient construction techniques. Here, an example of one of the famous multidimensional images that the Italian architect Giovanni Battista Piranesi made, in this case to explain how this funerary monument was built. And the invention of new media created also new opportunities to visualize the past. In his pioneering work, the Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Gatteschi took advantage of photography to very effectively juxtapose and compare the existing and the reconstructed. And with this example, we see an early attempt to provide the viewers with more information to be able to evaluate the proposed reconstruction hypothesis. And this is a topic that, as we know, is still very much applicable to present-day 3D reconstructions. Also, physical 3D models were already employed to represent the reconstructed buildings in their 3 dimensions. And here you can see the famous example of the 3-dimensional reconstruction of Rome in the 3rd century AD, which was made by the Italian architect Italo Gismondi in the late 1930s for a museum exhibition. If you've never seen it in person, I can tell you that this impressive 3D model takes up an area of about 200 square meters. So it fills up an entire room in the Museo della Civiltà Romana in Rome, and its complex making took up many years. With this quick overview, I wanted to show you that even before the introduction of digital media and computer graphics, there has been a long history of visual reconstructions which fulfilled already similar purposes to our current applications of 3D digital models. For example, their use as explanatory and interpretative tools. And also with Gatteschi, for example, we have seen an early attempt to open up the reconstruction process by showing both the extant remains and the reconstruction hypothesis, trying in this way to offer a way to address the problem of intellectual transparency in the reconstruction. Now, these drawings were understood to be artistic impressions subjected to a variety of interpretations. They were also usually published within a certain context of the book or the exhibition for which they were created, and they were never detached from it. All of this has changed with the introduction of computer-generated visualizations, which allowed the creation of photorealistic static images and animations with an increasing degree of immersion. And what was before understood as an evocative artistic impression was now seen as a more authoritative representation of the past because it was created by a computer. Digital images could also be easily replicated, modified, and widespread without any accompanying explanations about how they were created and for which purpose. In this slide, you can see some examples of images depicting a reconstruction hypothesis of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus that Ogilvy found over the internet some years ago, and that he collected to discuss exactly this problem. A large body of literature appeared, especially starting from the 1990s, to highlight and discuss these and other issues related to the creation of digital 3D reconstructions. And I summarized here the main criticisms the scholars have raised and that are still applicable today. Digital 3D reconstructions are still mainly used as illustrations, and other aspects are still underexplored, such as their contribution to investigate research questions. And moreover, they are seen as closed boxes, we can say, where viewers can only see the final results, the outside of the box. They are not given the opportunity to look inside, so to speak, at the data, the reasoning process that informed the reconstruction. Related to this aspect, also the limited reproducibility of 3D visualization has been pointed out, as well as the fact that the possibility to create and visualize alternative hypotheses has not been frequently exploited. One of the reasons we can identify to explain this is that the 3D modeling and the data interpretation are usually disjointed phases, one following the other, and they are entrusted to different people. And in this way, many observations that arise during the modeling process may end up being overlooked. And for this reason, I think that opportunity like this 3D modeling schools are very important for archaeologists and cultural heritage practitioners to get hands-on experience on these tools. In the following part of my talk, I'll illustrate how I tried to address these issues in my own research with two case studies. The first one is the multi-period site of Koronia in Boeotia, central Greece, which has been investigated by non-destructive methods within the Ancient Cities of Boeotia project led by Professor John Bentley. One of the aims of my PhD research within this project was to create a 3D environment that could act as a data integration platform to support the ongoing survey and a simulation tool to visualize alternative hypotheses on the late classical urban layout. Given the characteristics of the site and the aims of the work, I chose to approach the 3D reconstruction with a rule-based modeling strategy using the commercial software City Engine, which is mostly used nowadays for modern urban planning and geodesign. The second case study that I'll talk about is the reconstruction of the 17th century house of the Amsterdam patrician Peter de Graaf. And here the object of study is an historical house, and the characteristics of the data and the aims of the project called for a manual modeling approach with the open source software Blender in combination with image-based modeling with the open source photogrammetric software Measure. So we'll be looking at two case studies at totally different scales, one an entire city and the other one a house with the objects and the furniture pieces in its interior. And this will give us the opportunity to explore different research questions and applications of 3D modeling techniques. The survey at Koronia has yielded a large data set of scattered and overall poorly preserved remains of the various phases of occupation of the site, and here you can see some examples of finds. It is, moreover, a site where the context has been disturbed by later activities, and it has been extensively used for agriculture. The method of investigation to try to get as much information as possible was then to rely on a combination of various data sources, from pottery and architectural surveys to geophysical prospections to ancient sources and early modern travelers' accounts. You can imagine that manually model an entire urban site will be too time-consuming, and even more so since the data interpretation is still in progress, so we expect the 3D reconstruction to be updated in the future. And for this reason, a rule-based modeling approach is to be preferred. And the software City Engine allows the integration with GIS data, which was very important in our case as our survey data are stored in a GIS. So, first of all, what is rule-based modeling and how does it work if you never heard about that? As the name suggests, it means to create 3D models from a set of rules that follow a given shape grammar. Specifically, City Engine is based on the computer-generated architecture, CGA, shape grammar. It is a lesser-known modeling technique in my experience, and since the rule files that are written for Koronia are quite complex, I have a simpler and quick step-by-step tutorial or example, let's say, that I prepared for my students at Leiden University to show you how you will go about to create a building from scratch and to give you a feeling of how procedural modeling works. The case study for this quick 5 minutes demo is the Insula delle Volte Dipinte, the House of the Painted Walls in Ostia Antica. This house is one of the best preserved examples of domestic architecture dated to the Hadrianic period. And if you're familiar with Ostia, you know that one of the questions that scholars have asked and have hypothesized about is the original height of the insula. At present, there is no consensus about this, so the aim of this short exercise would be to visualize and evaluate alternatives, and of course, just for demonstration purposes to show you the technique, so don't take this as a historical accurate reconstruction. What you are seeing now is the City Engine workspace. First of all, I have imported a plan of Ostia and digitized the outline of 3 buildings, and this is the insula of the painted walls. Then I have initiated a rule by writing a conditional statement that allows me to visualize 3 different situations based on the satisfaction of a given precondition. And what I wrote here basically says, if the attribute for floors 4 is true, then extrude of 13 meters. If the attribute floors 5 is true, then extrude of 15 meters. And if no one is true, then extrude of 11 meters. Storing these numbers as so-called attributes is very convenient, as the attributes can be enabled or disabled on the fly on this panel called Inspector, and the 3D model changes accordingly, as you can see. Now we're going to add more details to the 3D building by defining each of the facades and the roof and the number of floors. And here again, by creating conditional rules so that the number of floors is created based on which initial condition is true. You also see that I've added an inline comment displayed in green, which references the publication by Felletti Mai, who studied this building and provided the measurements that I used for the reconstruction. And I put inline comments also in the roof files that I've written for Coronia, to reference the sources that I used and to explain some modeling choices. So I think it's a very interesting opportunity that modeling in this way affords. I then added other lines of code to create a sequence of doors and windows both on the ground floor and on the upper floors. And then I have associated the same rule to the other building outlines to quickly generate additional 3D geometries. Each of them can then be treated individually, for example, by assigning different heights. I then included some textures for the roofs, the windows, and the doors. And of course, now one may continue to go on by adding more texture and more lines to add more details, but we will stop here. As we already noticed, this modeling approach facilitates the visualization of different hypotheses in real time. For example, in this case, one could be interested in evaluating the view and the perception of space from the street level. And this can be done, for example, by assigning different heights as parameter of each building to see what is the impact. In the case of my work at Coronia, I have written the rule files based on comparative research on other Greek and Roman towns and architecture. And in the rules, I have included several parameters as attributes, so I can access them and change them on the fly in the inspector, as I showed you for the case of Ostia. Now, we don't have much time to go into details now, but if you want to have a closer look, the rules that I made are available on GitHub at the link that you find here. And I have uploaded an example of the 3D model of a house generated with this rule on Sketchfab. So you can have a look as well. These rules have been one component of a more elaborate workflow, which comprises the survey data stored and displayed in a 3D GIS as input and as initial input, together with the terrain information for which I suggested a reconstruction hypothesis based on historical aerial images and the results of the geomorphological analysis of the hill. In the rule files, I have also included the possibility to calculate the slope value of each initial building lot, which made it possible to use this visualization for exploratory research to simulate in real time alternative hypotheses about the location and number of houses that could fit on the hill, and to compare them to our archaeological remains. And in this short video, you can see how the 3D city changes when a different slope threshold is given as input. Coronia's 3D scene is georeferenced and can be exported as such as a geodatabase in ArcGIS for further analysis, for example, visibility analysis. And because data and reconstruction hypotheses are in the same spatial reference system, they can be overlapped and compared. The 3D scene that I created is available online, and it includes at present 2 alternative hypotheses of Coronia's urban extent, which are both possible given the current state of our knowledge of this site. And I've also set up a prototype cardboard VR to look around from the pedestrian point of view, and future work includes, in fact, updating the reconstruction and the virtual reality experience, because we would like to make it available as an educational tool for local school children. And in addition, we are reusing and adapting the set of rules that are created for Coronia for another ancient town in Boeotia, Hietos, which will give us interesting information to compare. So to conclude this first case study, what can we say about procedural modeling? Regarding the strong points of this modeling approach, we can say that it affords a formal parametric description of the 3D geometry and the efficient modeling of large environments and recursive geometry. So it is in fact a very good approach to tackle the modeling of a city, being it ancient or modern. Because they are text-based, the rule files or sections of them can be easily reused in other contexts. And as I showed you, inline comments can be added, which are useful as a memory aid for yourself, but also as a way to explain choices or to make references to sources. And these characteristics, I think, enhance the replicability and the intellectual transparency of the modeling process, especially when we are trying to visualize remains that are not existing anymore. It is also easy to update. I find it easier to update than models created with computer graphics software. Lines of code, for example, can be added in the rule files. Their parameters can be easily modified. Also, City Engine allows for a modular workflow, since data and rule files work independently from one another. So this approach is very convenient for creating hypotheses during an ongoing archaeological survey, as in our case. Moreover, specific to the software City Engine is the fact that it integrates very well GIS data. And this integration is usually lacking or poorly supported in computer graphics software. And the possibility of importing and exporting numerous file formats, for example, you can import shapefiles and export georeference 3D geometry as geodatabases, but also other numerous common formats using 3D graphics. This all enhances the interoperability of this software with other software packages. As to its weaknesses, procedural rules are not suited for detailed modeling. So there are ways to get around this by, for example, importing manually modeled 3D assets and subject them to procedural rules. But usually it's not really recommended for detailed modeling, and also not for modeling individual buildings. So it's not very time efficient with that. As we saw, its strengths are related to the fact that you can create architectural variations in a building type to fill in large areas. And it's also quite challenging to model the building's interior. So in the second case study, I'll show you, in fact, how I use Blender to do this. The CGA grammar is also software specific, so you need to have City Engine to interpret the code. And finally, I usually find that the learning process of rule-based modeling of City Engine is usually a bit more challenging than learning computer graphics software. So I think this graph is useful to show and to keep in mind. There is a certain amount of content creation, after which the initial investment of time to write the rule files is compensated, and otherwise manual modeling is still the best way to go. So let's now see a different case where manual modeling is actually the best approach. To do so, let's fast forward to the 17th century and go to Amsterdam with a reconstruction of the house of Pieter de Graaf. And the aspect that I would like to bring into focus now is how 3D modeling helps us to simulate the perception and the experience of space in the house interior. From a methodological point of view, I'll pay attention to the different degrees of uncertainty in the reconstruction and to the elaboration of alternative hypotheses and how we can use present-day methodologies to enable users to access this type of information. This research is part of the Virtual Interiors project, as Alicia was mentioning, financed by the Dutch Research Council. Through spatial mapping and visualization methodologies in 2 and 3 dimensions, this project aims to investigate the creation and display of artworks in 17th century domestic interiors, with the intention to add another piece of understanding to a knowledge of how Amsterdam became a great center of attraction and development for the cultural and creative industries at the time. And in fact, as Alicia was saying, I currently work as a postdoc in this project, and I carry out the historical research and the 3D modeling of a selection of interiors of houses that used to belong to art collectors and painters. What I'd like to talk about now is the reconstruction of the entrance hall to the house that Pieter de Graaf had built in 1664 on one of the larger canals in Amsterdam, the Herengracht. De Graaf that you see here in this portrait with his wife, Jacoba Bicker, was a member of one of the most influential families in Amsterdam at the time, and he lived in this house until his death in 1707. For this case study, I could rely on really a unique combination of data, which consists of a detailed probate inventory that was drawn up upon de Graaf's death, his almanacs, which he kept for over 40 years of his life, and which contain, among other things, information on the construction works on his house and several other archival documents as well. Another important source of information is the house itself, which is still standing, but has been obviously heavily modified over the centuries, both in the facade and inside. The most significant change for what I'm going to talk about took place in 1868 with the replacement of the original entrance door with a window. And in fact, these images that you can see in these slides display the current state of the facade on your left and how it appeared in the second half of the 18th century on your right. And this is the earliest visual reference that is available for this house, from which we can still see the entrance in its original location. As you can imagine, this change had a strong impact on what was, first of all, the function, of course, but also the appearance of the entrance hall, which is nowadays absolutely unrecognizable. And in fact, after the entrance was moved to the ground floor, this room has become a sort of empty chamber to the 2 side rooms. In these images, you can see what this room looked like until last year, when the building hosted the Amsterdam Museum of Bags and Purses, which unfortunately had to permanently close due to financial difficulties caused by the Corona crisis. And this modification in function made this room particularly interesting for 3D modeling, to shed light on its original appearance and in particular on its representational character as the access to the house and therefore the first thing the visitor would encounter when they entered the de Graaf's house. Some building plans from 1974 made available by the Amsterdam Monuments and Archaeology Office have been a useful starting point since they record some of the changes that the house underwent. For example, doorways that have been walled up at a certain point in time. And I visited the building several times to double check the plans and to try to correlate the rooms listed in the inventory with the corresponding current location. Based on these on-site observations, I digitized and re-elaborated the plans in AutoCAD and imported them into Blender to reassemble them into the 3D frame of the house and to proceed further with the modeling of the house and some of the rooms, one of them being, in fact, the entrance hall. So let's now see in more detail which objects and furniture we find in this room according to the inventory. As you can see, there were 2 paper candle holders, a map of South Polsbroek, and South Polsbroek was part of the Graaf family possessions outside Amsterdam, and the Graaf had inherited the title of Lord of this estate. Then we have an oak table with a marble top, a linked curtain from Izmir, a carved wooden bench, a marble table with a walnut foot, and 2 portraits in plaster. What stands out when comparing this inventory with other contemporary inventories is the total absence of paintings in the entrance. And in fact, if you try to visualize this room in your mind, the walls would have appeared rather bare, rather empty, given that according to the inventory, the only objects on the walls were the 2 maps and the portraits. And here the analysis of the almanacs comes to help, since in there, we found out that the walls were decorated with 10 Grisals paintings. And in fact, the Graaf in 1691 had commissioned the preparatory drawings to the famous painter Romain de Oeghem. In this image, you can see one of the entries in the almanacs in which the Graaf also notes down the allegorical subjects of the 4 largest Grisals: the education, the dedication, the probity, and the piety. Starting from this data, the search began to find objects that corresponded to the description in the inventory and in the almanacs, which served as starting points for the reconstruction. So I will give you just a few examples without going into much detail. For some, it was possible to find objects still preserved in the Graaf family archives. And this is the case of this handwritten map of South Polsbroek, which, as some passages from the almanacs tells us, had been commissioned by the Graaf himself to the land surveyor Johannes Lupenius. Or objects that are directly related to the family. For example, for the plaster portraits, I proposed the identification with the copies of marble portraits of the Graaf's parents that you see in the image, which is identification that is supported by the fact that the Graaf mentions in his almanacs that he had expressly requested a plaster copy of these portraits. And I take also the opportunity to show you the 2 different modeling techniques that I adopted for these objects. For the map, a manual modeling in Blender with a very simple geometry and the color information given by the image of the map itself. While for the portraits, I processed a series of photos in Mushroom, so you can see the differences between the 2. In other cases, such as for the tables, I relied on period furniture preserved at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. These are also modeled starting from images in Mushroom and then reworked in Blender, for example, to texturize the foot with the correct material that is described in the inventory. And finally, for the bench and the Grisals, I based the 3D models on the interiors of the 17th century Dutch doll houses that provide contemporary miniature evidence of the appearance of upper-class homes of the time. Before talking about where these objects were placed in the room, I would like to mention another aspect which the 3D reconstruction has allowed me to experiment on, namely the reconstruction of the floor. The Graaf notes the number and size of the tiles that he used in the entrance floor, and also gives us some indication to understand their pattern. He says that he used a total of 20.5 tiles of red Öland. He calls it the Swedish Red Stone, And this was a very popular stone at the time, imported from the island of Öland, southeast of the coast of Sweden. Each of the tile was 2 feet wide, so a little over 56 centimeters. And he says that he used them as bands in its entrance floor. We know what kind of other tiles he used because he had previously noted in his almanacs a purchase of a large quantity of Italian Carrara marble tiles. And we also know that the style of the time favored symmetry, and therefore a typical combination was that with a coffered ceiling, as in this case, the floor tiles were arranged in such a way as to mirror its partition. So by combining this information in the 3D reconstruction, it was possible to propose these two alternatives for the floor pattern, where there are actually 20.5 tiles of red Öland. So we see that the room gradually takes shape, but now we need to figure out the arrangement of objects and furniture. So by matching the rooms mentioned in the inventory with the 3D reconstruction of the interior, it was possible to retrace the path that the notary or his assistants followed to make the inventory of the properties. And by looking at which rooms are named before and after the entrance hall, we can also establish from which door they enter this room. We also saw in the inventory that there is a curtain about halfway down the list, which could only be placed hanging from the window above the entrance door. We therefore have these 2 points, the door giving access to the room and the position of the curtain to anchor the other objects on the list. And by keeping the order of the inventory, we arrive at this reconstruction hypothesis. And so we see that the 2 tables that in the list were separated by the curtain and the bench end up facing each other and thus contribute to the sense of symmetry of the room. And the bench ends up right next to the front door, a convenient location to accommodate visitors waiting for being received. And the free space in front of the bench must have created the space to open the door shutter. So now we have a better idea about which objects the visitors entering the house had in front of them. The maps with the city of Amsterdam, whose growth the De Graaf family felt they had greatly contributed to, the map with their estates in South Polsbroek, and the portraits, which, if we accept my proposal of identification, could in fact represent the Graaf's parents. These elements and the allegorical images on the walls surrounding those who entered the room sent very clear messages about the history and the importance of the De Graaf family, and also with the allegories in the Grisails, the quality that De Graaf deemed important. As in the case of Coronia, the reconstruction provided a platform for integrating information from various sources, of course, at a totally different data resolution, as you can see. And in this way has helped to suggest which of the objects would be visually more prominent for a person entering the house. So we've seen that a reconstruction is the result of a complex process of data collection, analysis, and interpretation. And this processing phase is very important and interesting, but to come back to one of the criticisms I listed in one of the previous slides, unfortunately, it often remains hidden. And in our case, the interpretations and choices that I briefly mentioned are all documented and accompanied by an index that expresses the degree of certainty with which I have reconstructed an object. All of this information and the 3D models come together in a prototype web viewer that my colleague Hugo Hurdeman has been working on, which allows users to explore and interact with the reconstructions. This is that you see the desktop version, but the virtual reality version for more immersive experience is also under development. So the web viewer that I used for Coronia is the standard web viewer developed and made available by Esri. And here we focused on developing our own with the functionalities that we deemed important to be included to make it into a sort of virtual research environment. And if you're interested in seeing this, again, I put the link to the video in this slide. For each object, users can access additional information on the reconstruction process. Also, direct links take them to the scanned copies of the archival sources that are used for the reconstruction. So here you can see, for example, one of the entries in the Graf's diary when the map of by Lupinius is mentioned. And also there are links to external resources with additional information, for example, on the artists or artisans who made the objects. And by leveraging the linked data resources, we can show, for example, images of the same creator or of the same type, so that this environment can become the starting point for future exploration. Annotations can be added as well on each object, and users can also view an overlay with the a color-coded scheme, which signals what I said before, the different degrees of certainty in the proposed reconstruction. And they can also switch between alternative. In this case, for example, the two reconstruction hypotheses of the pattern of the floor, and see how they behave in the context of the room. This research environment allows users also to experiment a bit with, for example, the effect of various lighting conditions, and to interact with the objects by moving them, scaling them, or rotating them, and try out alternative positions and hypotheses. So in conclusion, in my view, the digital format of reconstructions can have a great impact on the research practice. And specifically, the digital model, I think, can enable a three-step process of knowledge creation, sharing, and discovery, which was not possible before. First, new insights are potentially generated during the making of the reconstruction. Then this new knowledge is presented to the viewer in an online platform, for example. And finally, as we aim to do with the virtual interiors viewer, users gain, discover, and create additional knowledge through the interaction with the 3D environment and the exploration of the underlying and linked data sources. And I would like to close with some of the challenges that I think still remain open in this field. The main challenge that I see at the moment is to develop stable solutions for storing, accessing, and publishing annotated 3D models in such a way that 3D reconstructions can be explored in the long term, together with the underlying web of interrelated sources and reasoning process that led to their creation, so that indeed the context of creation is kept intact and they become self-standing sources of information. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Chiara. That was incredible. And two beautiful examples of the different approaches you could take to 3D modeling. Before we open it up to questions, again, if you have a question, you can write it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. I think I'll start off the questions by saying that one of the main themes we've been addressing in the summer school is documentation and making the meta and paradata accessible. And as you mentioned, one of the downsides to the City Engine program is that you need the software in order to interpret the code. So I was just wondering how this affects the sharing of your data, and how, if you have any ideas of how you work around it.
Yeah, it's, in fact, I pointed this out because I think it's a very, very important issue. And the rule finds in City Engine, in fact, so if you want to see the results, so if you want to see the 3D scene, you have to have City Engine, you have to have a license. If you want to inspect the rule files, they are just text. So you can, of course, open them in any text editor. So there is a specific, this CGA format, but you can open it in whatever text editor you like. So there are, I think it's like two different levels. If you just want to have a look, let's say, behind the scenes, you can still do it. You can still open these rule files and read them, and read the comments, and read all the additional information that they contain. But if you want to really make them operational, let's say, then you need the license. So there is no other at present open source counterpart, let's say, open source alternative for City Engine. And I think the interesting thing of this software is that because it was acquired by Esri, they really pushed forward the integration with GIS. So for our work, we work a lot with GIS data. So when you have to deal with the reconstruction of a city and you also have GIS data, it is something that, although I'm a supporter of the open source movement and open source software, but yeah, it's still the best that we can get to address these problems.
Thank you. Would you like to take over for the questions?
Well, while we're waiting for other people to put questions in chat or raise their hands, I have a question which you sort of answered just as I was formulating it. I thought this was going to be, but I think there's still some question in there. I wanted to say that I really loved your visualization of the De Graaf house. That was really nicely done. It's beautiful. It's almost photorealistic, and you clearly you encapsulated in your presentation and in the visualization itself the three core reasons for doing this sort of 3D visualization. Right, one is it is this wonderful, photorealistic, engaging, public-facing thing that enables people to interact with the house and to get a sense of what it was like to be in there. Second is that it's a communication tool. It communicates your theories and your conclusions and your research, including your uncertainty, your sources for certain decisions, your arguments for certain decisions, and so forth. And third is it's a research tool that they can do new make new discoveries using your visualization as the tool for that. But I was wondering, and this is the very small part of this, the question that you didn't already answer before I had a chance to ask it, is if you thought maybe the photorealistic nature of it, and I know it's not quite photorealistic in the technical sense, but that sense of it being really wonderful and you feeling like you're in there, if that was maybe necessarily a good thing for some of the other things. I mean, obviously it became less photorealistic when you colored it for certainty, for example. But is there a case where for some uses of your model, you would want it to be less photorealistic, less beautiful?
Yeah. Well, I think this is a very important observation because, and I thought about it actually more for the case of Coronia than for this case in Pieter de Graaf. And I think it boils down to the question, what you want to do with it? What are the questions they want to answer? If it's just like, I think, like a spatial analysis, for example, that you want to see, okay, where the objects were positioned, what is the volume that they took, in the room. Yeah, I think that you don't really need textures or photorealistic images to do that. But when it comes, so that's why I had some. Yeah, I thought, well, for Coronia, I could have really used a much more schematic visualization. Although we want to also have it as an educational tool as well. So I think still to communicate what you are doing to other people. This sort of realistic component is still important. And for the house of Pieter de Graaf, I think the photorealistic let's say attempt was also given by the fact that I wanted to try to sort of recreate the perception of space. And I think that you really, like with the materials, I had information on the materials of the floor tiles, for example, on how the materials of the tables, and so there are also informations that you can convey by using this more realistic approach. But it's definitely a good question, and always to keep in mind, because of course there is also a lot of time going into try to create this feeling. So I think every time you have to ask yourself, okay, is it worth it? Do I really need it, or can I just go for a grayscale model? And in fact, for the because I modeled the whole house, and for the work that I'm doing on mapping the paintings, the schematic 3D model is grayscale. It's just good enough. So yeah, so I think every situation requires asking this question. In fact.
Thank you. One thing I just remembered that I wanted to say was that some of the URLs that you put in the slides weren't very visible. So do you think you could put the link to your model in the chat at some point?
Of course, yeah.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Should I do it right now?
If you have it handy, yes, please.
Yes. I'll try to get them. Yeah. Which ones? So the 3D scene wasn't really that visible. All of them. Well,
I wasn't able to copy any of them down quickly enough anyway. So any that you had, but particularly the one to the 3D model, yeah, that was great.
Perfect. Yes.
Thank you. In the meantime, Hannah has a question.
Hi, thank you. That was an absolutely fantastic paper. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, on the house that you showed us, I love the fact that users can move things around themselves. They can play around with it. So you told us, they could move the table, they could change the lighting, they could see what was certain, they could change it so they could see what was certain and not certain, and so on. Now, this is coming from a position of complete and utter ignorance, so I apologize for the stupidity of this question. But can the users then save what they have done for themselves to then come back to, or is it something that you play around with that on the model and then that's that? So what I want to know is, can they take that research that they've been doing from your model and take it away from them for themselves to then utilize themselves, if that makes sense? I'm sorry, I'm really garbled.
No, it makes perfect sense, and it's actually very interesting. We were also thinking about how to sort of follow the behavior of users, and I have to say now I think I mentioned it. I'm going to stress it a lot again. It's a prototype, so we are developing, and while doing this, we were thinking about what kind of features are interesting, and I thought really, okay, these things that people can break it down, and do what they want with it, which I think for some people it's a bit concerning even, but I think it's really, really important for making users a bit more engaging with the content. And I think what you said is really it will be very interesting. At this moment, it's not included in the prototype, but we're thinking of ways of doing it. You would require like a user account, some sort of a platform where you can save this content, and the same goes for the annotations, of course, because that would be also very interesting to have others people annotations and see, because we thought about the annotations as a way, of course. Now the example that I showed you was to place an additional extra information, but it could also be observations about the model. Okay, why did you do that? And I don't agree with this. And all sorts of annotations. So it would be very interesting to keep them and to track them. But we are in the stage of,
In that sense, it becomes also a way that you're learning as well. So it then becomes
exactly
a research tool for you as well as a research tool for the users. Because it's certainly, if there are things that you're not sure about, that you've made an interpretation on, and then someone else might come and say, well, hang on a minute, have you seen this that's over in XYZ? And I haven't seen that. And then then a tool for dialogue. for research.
Yeah. Well, you I think you capture perfectly what I had in mind with this, and as well as the linked data thing. I was actually very interested in. Okay, let's see if there is something in these linked data repositories that I haven't seen, because of course I have been looking and searching by myself and manually, let's say, but maybe by using this linked data, there could be something. No, it didn't pop up just yet, but yeah, these things are also very much in progress. So
superb. It's so exciting. It's superb.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I'm really happy to hear it.
I'd like to sort of steal part of Katarina's comment in the chat and turn it into a question, which is about user testing. You talked about the pedagogical value and one of the ways you might use this. And I wondered if you'd done any study in how people use this. I mean, this is maybe partly related also to Hannah's question about being able to save things that people change. But do you have any sense of either from the site or from having done studies, watching people or whatever, of how people use the 3D model, what sort of things they do? Do they zoom in? Do they pan around?
Mm-hmm.
Do they want to move into different areas? Do they come in very quickly and go out very quickly? Have you got any sense of and is that user information valuable to you?
Yeah, so that was it's part of the work of my colleague actually, which I participated as well a bit, but it was mainly his part of the work in developing the user interface and also in carrying out this user test. So he just finished a number of people, a number of tests with people interacting with this. So and it's going probably to write up also some of these observations in a blog post on our website. And it was definitely very, very interesting. He also made some changes in the interface. For example, there were, buttons that were not, then you realize you're doing it and you think it's clear, and then you realize that for other people, it's not that clear. And it was also, interesting to see that for some people, because they are very much used to static images, even the fact that you could move around was a bit surprising. So they just looked at the image at the beginning and they didn't really look around in space. So yeah, I think it's really, really useful to and it's always a pity, because I think one good thing in our project is that this user evaluation phase was thought about before. And what you see many times with projects with 3D reconstructions is that, okay, this is the end product and it's out there, and the user phase it's usually not incorporated. And I think it's very important and very useful to do that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Anna also has a question.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. That was really impressive. Talking about static images, I was just wondering if you ever thought of also remodeling ancient humans in your city of Coronea, because there's always the discussion about reconstructions, whether if it's ground plans or 3D modeled cities, because there's no people living in it. That is, was the case, obviously. And especially when you were planning of showing this to students and in schools, I was just wondering if you ever thought of that, or if this is just due to the software that you use, because I guess City Engine is not including human beings, but because it's only including architecture.
Exactly. Well, yes, that's one of the things that it's meant for architectural modeling. But these things that you said about modeling people, it's definitely very interesting. And I think it would be very interesting, for example, like combining a sort of space syntax type of approach with actual, human avatars, let's say, to see where people would go. So to really track movements, for example, in the city. So not just for a visualization purpose, but also, again, for sort of research, research purposes on try to see, okay, did didn't make sense to have a city like that, and where would people gather? So also using maybe AI technologies, yeah, that would be really, really interesting. This was my PhD project, so it was, yeah, I mean, the phases of be included into the participate to the survey data gathering, and the reconstruction was mainly the idea. But of course, then, yeah, it could be many more future venues where these models could be reused, and this could be a very, very interesting one.
Thank you. Hans has just raised his hand.
Yeah, like everyone else, I'm enormously impressed and intimidated even. And my question stems from that. And since I was just wondering, how long it would take, for example, to generate something like the Coronea simulation, and never mind the Amsterdam house, which I imagine is a project for several years. And so, since you mentioned it being a PhD, would I be right to infer that this is in fact a 3-year project to get this done in the excellent way that you've done it?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot about time, and I'm always a bit confused about what to reply, because of course it was also the rule-based modeling was also learning by doing in the process. So I was also learning the technique while I was trying to do that. So of course, if you factor in also the time that you have to learn to do something, that things are expand a bit, and of course it's similar, as you saw, as a scripting language. So you make mistakes. There are some bugs in it. So there are a lot of things that you have to solve, which of course increases also the time that you spend on it. So I think to answer this question, I think procedural modeling and rule-based modeling are efficient if you think that, in fact, you model some architecture, and then you can really populate large environment with that, or you think about reusing the rule files in another project, and then the investment of time becomes efficient, because then you're working in different projects with the same set of rule files. Yeah. Otherwise, yeah, it might be a bit too time consuming. But yeah, if you think about all the things that you learn as well, that's also, I think it's important. So.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Thank you.
That would be true for anyone starting such a project, of course. So it is important to factor in the learning curve in a time estimate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So I don't see any other questions immediately. If not.
So should I just copy paste? Or do you have another? Yeah, I'll copy and paste the because I was a bit distracted in answering the question. So let me see this one, and this is the links to the root files. Yeah, and another thing that I didn't mention about the root files, and might be interesting as well, is that some of the grammar then gets deprecated with new releases. So now I was checking also the root files that I made a few years ago to see if they work, and they still work fine, fortunately. But I see some bits of syntax that are not in use anymore. So I should update that as well. So that's also part of the aging process of these tools that one needs to take into account a bit.
Great, thank you very much. I think in that case, back to Alicia.
Yeah, I guess thank you again so much, Chiara, for joining us and teaching us all of this.
Thank you.
Thank
you for inviting me, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, I think it's been great for all of us. So, yeah, thank you again for everyone joining us, and hope you have a nice evening.
Yeah, thank you. It really has been wonderful. It's great.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.